Thank you so much for being with us this morning. If we haven't met yet, my name is Dan, and I'm the lead pastor here at the Alliance. This month, we're closing out a series that we're doing, which is really about following Jesus. What are the aspects of following Jesus? Kind of like followership 101. We've covered a lot of ground, and this morning we close it out with a message called Make a Plan. Now, when Asa was little, he's 15 now, he's taller than I am. I don't know where he got his height from. I've been praying for it. Somebody's got to break the cycle in our family. So he's taller than I am, but when he was little, before he could even walk, we had a regular pattern every single Saturday when his mom, Janine, was working. We would go to the coffee shop together. And we would spend a couple of hours there. I'd drink coffee, and he would crawl around on the dirty floor. And eventually, he would learn to walk there. People saw him learning to walk, and he became the staple at our local coffee shop. Now, by our local coffee shop, I mean we lived in a town so small, we had a coffee shop, okay? And that's the one we went to. He learned to walk there. He kind of grew up in the sight of people because we were there consistently. He looked forward to it every single week, and so did everybody else. I became known as Asa's dad, right? I'm like, I've introduced myself to them before. It's not that they didn't know my name. They choose to go by Asa's dad because they liked him better, which I get. I like him better. He's a great guy. Now, it wasn't just that pattern. We had a lot of patterns in our family that he just kind of learned to rely on as he grew up. Asa, more than I think any of our kids, was a creature of habit. He looked forward to the same things at the same time every single week, every single month, every single year. And it got to the point where if we were making family plans and he knew about the family plans and those plans had to change, we had to work as early as we could to reset his expectations in these plans. We would have to start drip feeding some of the changes so that when we revealed the whole thing, it wasn't a crushing blow to his sense of well-being. Even when we moved out here a few years ago, we had to give him a pretty big on-ramp. Even before we knew what we were going to do, we had to say, hey, listen, Asa, we aren't going to live where we are forever. You just need to be aware of that. We don't know what's next, but God has something different for us. And we started kind of drip feeding it. Even when we came out to interview for the job, we said, one thing that has to happen is we'll come out and interview, but we have to bring our oldest, because he's got to know what's going on. That's just part of who he is. It created a sense of security and identity and understanding. And it's not just him. He might, from what I've seen, he might be more entrenched in some of those things. But the truth is, every kid thrives on pattern and structure. There's been so many studies done about the importance of structure and predictability in the lives of kids. It produces this sense of well-being, this sense of security and safety that helps them thrive in life. And I want to clue you in on something. Did you know that you used to be a kid? Some of you have forgotten. Some of you forgot you used to be a kid. Life beats it out of you sometimes, doesn't it? But you used to be a kid. And as a child, you thrived with structure. Some of you didn't have structure that you needed, and it produced a sense of unsettledness in your life. But even now as an adult, you and I, believe it or not, and some of you might even argue with me on this, you and I still need predictability in our lives. Our brains are hardwired for predictability at some level. And you would think that the constant cycle of day in and day out structure would produce monotony, and for some of you, you're like, it does. I need every day changing. I want it dynamic. Guess what? That's your pattern. All of us have created a pattern at some level. It might not be somebody else's pattern, it's our pattern. We've all created a structure of daily living that we live by. Think about it. What is the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning? My guess is most mornings that's the same. What do you do before you go off to work, or if you're in school, what do you do before you go off to school? There's probably a pattern. Maybe you haven't actually even noticed it, but you do the same things at relatively the same time. What do you do when you get home after a long day? What do you do just before bed? When's the first moment you pick up your phone or turn on the TV during the day? All of us live with some kind of pattern. It's kind of that home base for us that allows us to actually not be stuck in a rut, but it allows us to actually produce a sense of well-being and safety and security in our lives. It even allows us to deal with the chaos and unstructured aspects of the world. Fascinating. Now, here's the thing, though. Some of us, maybe not all of us, some of us live in patterns that are intentional. Most of us live patterns of life that are unintentional and they're just on autopilot. We don't even think about them. But all of our patterns, every single person's pattern produces something. Your pattern produces something. My pattern produces something. Now we have the choice between being intentional about that pattern or unintentional about that pattern. Bottom line, though, is they do produce something. Now, Jesus talked about this very thing, believe it or not. I want to invite you to turn with me to John chapter 15. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn there, you can follow along. It's going to be on the screen, or you can pull out your phone and follow along. Now, Jesus is teaching in a metaphor, and we're not going to talk about the entire section that he covers this metaphor, but we're going to skip through it. And even more, hang on, for some of you who are very linear thinkers, we're going to go backwards through it. We're going to start near the end of Jesus' argument, and we're going to work backwards toward the beginning. So John chapter 15, we'll start actually in verse 16 and read that first. Jesus is teaching mostly his disciples and the crowds, but mostly his disciples. He says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you." We're starting at the end because as Jesus is giving his disciples, his followers, a lesson in followership, one of the things Jesus teaches them is that his followers will have a fruitful life. Everybody say fruitful life. Fruitful life. You guys you're nailing this. You're so much better than a few weeks ago. You should be proud of yourselves. Every disciple of Jesus, every follower of Jesus is meant to have a fruitful life. That's why Jesus looks at his disciples. He says, you may think that it was your choice to follow me, but you didn't have a choice to follow me unless I called you. You responded to me, yes, that is a choice, but you had no ability to make a choice until I first called you. Now, why would Jesus say that to his followers? Because he's setting them up. He's setting them up to receive something about followership. We'll get there in a moment. Jesus says, "You didn't choose me, I chose you." It's my initiative towards you that is causing something in your life now. And as followers of Jesus, you were chosen and appointed, Jesus says, so that you might go and bear fruit. It's fruitful living. That's the end result of a follower of Jesus. Not growth, not understanding, not knowledge, not morality. Fruitful living. We're going to backtrack just a couple more verses earlier. We're going to go back to verse 8. Jesus is going to say something somewhat similar, but with a different nuance. He says this in verse 8, "This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit." There's the fruitful living again. Everybody say fruitful living. "Showing yourselves to be my disciples." Now, Jesus in verse 16 picks that up again, and he says, it is the purpose of a follower of Jesus to have a fruitful life. You are meant to produce something. You are not consumers, you are producers. That is what it means to be created in the image of God. Now, Jesus in verse 8 says, not only will you produce fruit, but there is something about the fruit that you produce in your lives that will identify you as my followers. The types of things we produce, somebody can look at and say, you followed Jesus. That's kind of a tall order, especially when you think about what it would have meant to be in association with Jesus. People were looking at Jesus, they saw the things Jesus did, and a lot of the things Jesus did were everyday things that you and I would do. Oftentimes, though, with just a small nuance. You know, one of the things Jesus was accused of was partying. That's my kind of Jesus. Those of you who have spent some time with me, they're like, that's false. You fall asleep at 8:30 on the couch. We all define parties in different ways, okay? Get off my back. So Jesus did all these things and he had just a little bit of a nuance to it, but then there were several things that were in the life of Jesus that were very different. In fact, supernaturally different to the point where only God through somebody could produce it. So when Jesus says, listen, when people see your fruit, they're going to see that you're a follower of me. He's talking about the whole gambit. He's talking about the weird things and the crazy things and the everyday things with just a little bit of a nuance, because Jesus wasn't just accused of being a partier. He was accused of hanging out with the wrong types of people because he knew God loved them. That's the kind of fruit that will identify us as followers of Jesus. That's the kind of things you and I are supposed to produce in our lives. Everybody say fruitful life. Fruitful life. That's good. You're going to have such a plot twist when I tell you that's not the point. I'm kidding. We're going to backtrack just a little bit more. We're going to go to the beginning of John 15, verses 1 through 4. Jesus says this, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. So Jesus ends this section saying, listen, the goal of being a follower is to have a fruitful life. You are supposed to produce something. And that something, he says in verse 8, is going to indicate who you follow, because guess what? Everybody follows something or someone. You don't have a choice. Whether you follow something, everybody follows. We all think our own thinking is super original. I promise you, there is nothing new under the sun. We all follow something. We all follow someone. Jesus says those who follow him will be recognized by the things they produce. And now in verses 1 through 4, he gets into the metaphor of where that understanding of fruitful living and type of fruit originates. And he says, I am the true vine. Now, when Jesus is saying this, he's talking about being the faithful one. Israel in the Old Testament was referred to as a vine. They were intended to produce something, but they didn't produce it. They were a failed vine in the Old Testament. Now, Jesus comes along and he says, I am the true vine. Meaning Jesus is doing what Israel was supposed to do all along. His life produces that which God intended it to produce. He is the true, the real, the legitimate vine. And he says his Father is the gardener. The Father is the one that Jesus steps into subservient relationship with. Though he is equal with him, while he steps into the flesh, Jesus becomes subservient to the Father for a season. And as he does so, the Father as the gardener trims the vine. He plants it. He makes it become what it is intended to be. Jesus refers to himself as this vine that grows the branches, and the Father as the gardener, he comes along and he cuts back any branch that doesn't produce fruit. Do you guys remember what the purpose of a follower of Jesus is? You got it. I didn't even have to ask for it. Oh gosh, I'm so proud of you. Yes, it's good. It's fruitful living. Jesus says the gardener, the Father, every branch that doesn't produce fruit, he will cut off. Now, in our minds, we might think, yeah, of course, every branch that is dead and is rotting on the vine should be taken off. That makes sense. But did you know there's a difference between a branch that just grows and a branch that produces fruit? I've heard so many Christians in their life say, I just want to grow in Christ. That's great. But the goal for you is not to just grow. You have to grow to get to fruit, but the goal is fruit. You can't just learn things. It has to produce something in you. There's a lot of people who know a lot of theology and it never manifests in their life. It's pointless. That's a branch that might be cut off. Jesus didn't say they will know that you are my followers because you can recite the entirety of Scripture. The Pharisees did that. And they're the specific ones in this parable, in this metaphor that Jesus is referring to. They're the unfruitful ones. They have a lot of growth. They look like they should be able to produce something, but they don't. Those are the ones the Father is going to cut off, and now Jesus is referring to the judgment in the end. And then he says, now there are branches that are remaining in me. They're attached to the vine, and they produce something. And the Father is going to prune those so that they can become even more fruitful. Now, the process of farming, grapes in particular, which is very likely what Jesus is talking about, is the process of cutting back the weaker branches that aren't producing as much so that the stronger branches can grow. And even those branches seasonally need to be taken back at times. And when they come back, they have a greater produce at the end. They produce a greater fruit. That's the goal of a branch, is to support the fruit. So Jesus is saying, listen, every branch that is in me, every branch attached to my life source is going to produce the same fruit that is identifiable with the vine. Listen up. You and I have a goal of being fruitful in our living. We are supposed to produce fruitful lives, but here's the catch. It's not our fruit. We produce Jesus' fruit. We do that as fruitful branches connected to the source. That's why Jesus continues on. He says in verse 3, he says, you are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Now he's talking to the disciples around him. And what I love, this little nuance in Greek, because believe it or not, this wasn't written in English, it was written in Greek. And there's a Greek word for prune, and it appears a couple of times here. The first one is when Jesus says, every branch that does bear fruit, the Father will prune back so that it is even more fruitful. The other occurrence of prune is when he says, you are already clean. Because the word for prune actually means to shore up, to trim back, and to clean off. It's the active process of cultivating something that is meant to produce fruit. It was an agricultural term used for what the vine dressers would do when they would pick a branch up that was fruitful. They would clean it off and they'd tie it back to the support structure. And Jesus says, because, he's talking to his disciples, he says, because you are already in relationship with me, you are connected to the life source. There is everything in the disciples that they already need in order to produce fruit. The very source of life that produces fruit in Jesus' life is now already in the disciples, already in his followers, not just because of what he spoke, but because of the embodiment in Jesus' living where his words matched his actions. What I love more than anything is when Jesus comes on the scene, it says he preaches the kingdom, and almost without fail, every time Jesus declares the good news of the kingdom, he also heals the sick. You and I don't always understand how much that action, especially healing, is related and integral to the central aspects of the gospel of Jesus. Jesus is saying that source, that life that produces those things in my living is now flowing through his followers because they have been with him. They have stayed with him, but the goal isn't just to have been with him. He says this as he continues on in verse 4, remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me, because it's Jesus' fruit. It's not my fruit. If I could produce it, I already would have produced it. There is fruit that Jesus wants to produce through you and I, through me, that we can only produce when we remain connected to him because our lives produce something. Here's the problem. I don't always pay attention to the patterns that I'm living to make sure it's producing what it's intended to produce. Remember, you and I each have patterns, but are they producing what it's supposed to produce? We're supposed to produce the fruit that comes through the vine of Jesus in our living. The question is, do our patterns produce that? There's a couple key things. One, we have beat to death already. It is that we are supposed to live fruitful lives. We are supposed to produce something. The other is that in order to produce something of value, something fruitful, we have to remain connected to the life source. That's the person of Jesus. It's a relational connection. We have to stay connected to Jesus. Now, the fruit isn't ours. We can't actually produce that. We only produce the fruit through staying connected to Jesus. Therefore, the issue that stands in front of us as our responsibility of followers of Jesus is to remain. And in order to remain in Jesus, we need a support structure for that. In fact, if we're going to live fruitful lives, we have to understand something, that our role in all of this as fruitful branches is that we need a trellis to stay connected. Fruitful branches need a trellis to stay connected. A trellis is a support system. Some of us grew up with a phenomenal support system in our lives. Some of us didn't. God has been good to you in the midst of it. I remember watching one individual who was actually friends with my brother, my younger brother, growing up. And I remember even in the moment, I didn't have a ton of words for it. I didn't have a great understanding of it, but I saw the outworking of it. Is we grew up with very different support systems in our families. He had no family. And even the family that was with him decided to move, and they said, well, you can stay here or you can go. And he decided to stay, and they're like, okay, see ya. And I remember thinking about everything that he had to do in life was so much harder because when he went to get a car, my parents helped me with connections to go get a car. He didn't have any connections. Everything that he did that was trying to get him somewhere in life needed so much greater effort without the support system behind him. And I took it for granted so often. God woke me up to the reality of support systems through watching what he had to go through. Support systems matter. And in the life of a vine, the support system is a trellis. Now, when a gardener or when a vine dresser is producing grape, a vineyard, there needs to be a support structure. Even before our modern techniques around farming were produced with poles and wires that run between the poles to support the vines, there was a different system. They would plant a vineyard in between the structure of two mature trees that were close enough to each other. And they would plant the grapes next to them, and they would keep them tied to the trees because the grapes had no significant structure in themselves. The fruit would be in the dirt, and it would rot, and it would overproduce, and it wouldn't be cultivated well. It needed a structure from the very beginning to be healthy. It's not a defect in the product. It's not a defect in the vine. It's an understanding of how God created humanity to work together with the rest of creation. And so we were to come along and we were to cultivate it. So they would tie these vines up between significant support structures. And over time, it was developed to the point where a trellis was formed with poles in the ground and wires running between the poles, usually two. And as the vine matured, those branches would be tied to the trellis and cut back seasonally. They would be pruned at the end of the season so that they could grow, and they would be tied up to the leaves as they grew. And as the vine matured, it didn't need all of the wires that were given to it. It only needed to reach the first wire, and that's where it started. But as it grew and matured, it got tied up to the second wire. Without that trellis, the growth and the fruit is unsupported, and there's the risk of the branch snapping off and no longer being connected to the vine. One of the things you and I have responsibility over in our lives is to develop a trellis that will support the work that God wants to do through us. In us and through us. And the way we develop this trellis is through creating a plan that is intentional. It's about paying attention to our habits, our patterns, and the things we hope to produce in life that God is calling us to, and then making sure that the systems of our life coincide with that production. Now, there's a few key ideas that we need to be aware of when we're producing a trellis for our plan, which is really making a plan for how we remain connected to Jesus. You and I need a plan to remain connected to Jesus. Without it, we will be unstructured, unintentional, and it will feel like, what's the point? We will feel the growth, but there won't be any fruit. We need a plan. There's a few things that are big elements in order to create a healthy plan that you have to pay attention to. And some of us in these elements are going to have to undo some things in our life in order to redo some things in our life that are intentional. And the other thing I would say before we dive into these three elements is that some of us have a lot of things we want to produce in our life, but they're not the main things that Jesus calls us to. You're also going to have to make sure that your trellis isn't cluttered with the wrong things, but is cut back to the main things. So the first element of building a trellis, of making a plan in our life, is to take a look at our schedules. Seems very elementary, right? Following Jesus, there's a 101 level that we have to grab hold of, and the first thing we have to do is our schedule. Now, the moment I say that, some of you think, I can't add more to my schedule. I have so much on my schedule. That's true. We are a chronically busy and borderline burned out culture in America. Part of that is because we have tried to produce and produce and produce, but we haven't produced the main thing by remaining in Jesus. You can produce a lot with your life, but is it reflecting the vine? If you can learn how to structure your schedule, if you can learn how to format your schedule so that it is around the person of Jesus, then all of the other things that you desire will find their place in the structure. But we have to start with the biggest, the most main things, the vine itself, and that starts with our schedule. Now, in an overly busy society, I value the words of author John Mark Comer when he says this. It's not going to be up on the screen for you. I just want you to listen. The solution to an over busy life is not more time. It's to slow down and simplify our lives around what really matters. How many times have you thought, if I just had a couple extra hours in the day? The answer isn't more time. Actually, there are so many productivity studies that show that any input you do over 50 hours a week, 50 to 55 hours a week, you actually don't produce more, you're just more tired. In fact, the work that you do produce ends up being lesser than what it could be. The answer isn't always to do more. Sometimes the answer is to do less, which means taking a look at our schedule and saying, what is the main thing? It's not about adding more, it's about focusing on the main things, as Comer says. Step one of building a trellis, of making a plan for pursuing Jesus, is looking at your schedule to see what is filling it. What fills your schedule? Some of us, maybe there's a lot of room. Others of us, step one is to make margin. There's not even any room. There's only 24 hours in the day. I suppose I could sleep less. That's not the answer. Jesus likes you to sleep. You should do it. Some of you need to hear that for real. I could do fine on 5 hours. You say, no. You've learned to survive on 5 hours and you don't know any different. That's different, okay? Some of you need to make margin. You're producing a lot, but the fruit, it's lacking. It needs to be cut back. So take a look at your schedule first. The second part of it is once we have the margin and once we have the space in our schedule, we have to look at the structure, the things we fill the schedule with. Once you have space and time, you can now add the what are we going to do. And there's a few key components here that should fill our structure. And it might look different for different people based on where you are in your walk with Jesus and what your next steps are. But all of them will include things like prayer, gathering with a worshiping body, being in community, which those two things are different. Gathering with a worshiping body and community are two different things. I just need you to know that. And then living a life on mission. Those are non-negotiables of what categorically the fruit of Jesus looks like. Prayer is connection to the Father. Worship and word is connection to the Father and others. Community is about being known in community and not having any place to hide because that's what you chose to do. And living life on mission is just simply doing what Jesus did. Those are the four key elements we can't get away from. I don't think you can boil it down any more. Now, all of us might be at different places in those four things, but that should make up the elements of the structure of our schedule. It should make up the structure, the things that we fill it with, and it should be in these cycles of daily, weekly, monthly, and annual patterns that we live out. If you look at the life of Jesus, he had scheduled prayer times daily, weekly, and monthly, and annually. There are so many references to Jesus. I believe it's a daily thing, even though Scripture doesn't outright say it, where he woke up early to pray, he stayed up late to pray, or sometimes he stayed up all night to pray. That was it's one of the most described things about Jesus' structure in his life. It was a daily thing. And then he had some weekly or monthly things where he would become a little bit overwhelmed with the pressure and he would need to get away for an entire day with the Father. Now, sometimes people didn't let him have that. They chased him down. They wanted more food. They wanted more healing. They wanted whatever he had to offer. So there were times where he just had to get in a boat. You might be busy, but you've probably not gotten into a boat yet. Some of you have locked yourselves in the bathroom at home. And that's as close as you've gotten to a boat in the middle of the lake to get away from people. But Jesus had that as a pattern. It was the structure of his life, and it was one of the most important elements. And the final thing is within the metaphor of the vine, and that's there are seasons that we have to pay attention to. Just as there are seasons of growth, there are seasons of fruitfulness, and there are seasons of pruning, you and I need to be aware of what season God is calling us to. Sometimes God calls us to less, to be pruned back to the very essentials of what it means to be connected to Jesus. And sometimes he's going to ask us to grow and utilize more of the trellis. Your plan will sometimes be more bare, and sometimes it will be fuller. And you will have to look at that plan because the plan that got you to this season won't be the right plan for the next season. Our seasons have to shift. And they have to shift because the most important thing is to remain. Our plan serves not to develop a plan. You don't have a plan because the point is the plan. A gardener, a vineyard owner doesn't build a trellis because the point is the trellis. The trellis supports the fruitful living and helps the branch remain connected to the vine. That's what you and I can do. The fruit isn't ours, it's Jesus's, but we can develop a system around us so that we remain connected to Jesus. And when our plan is pulling us away from Jesus, it's time to go back to the schedule and make sure that there's margin for it. It's time to look at the structure to see if it's filled, your schedule is filled with the things that will support your remaining in Jesus. And then you have to look at the seasons to say, is this still working? Because if it's not, you have to re-examine the plan. Every follower of Jesus needs to create a plan. And your plan's not going to look exactly like your neighbor's, and that's okay. All of us are in process. You don't need to be where you aren't. You don't need to produce something that your neighbor produces, but be certain Jesus will produce something through you if you'll let him. Because the goal is fruitful living. I want to pray over you this morning.